I have been the verger of St. Bartholomew's for 41 years, and in that time, I have prepared the church for 317 weddings. I have polished the brass, filled the font, arranged the flowers, set out the prayer books, and stood at the back of the nave in my good coat to make certain that everything proceeds with the dignity a house of God requires. My name is Alfred Ennis. I am 63 years old, and I have seen every kind of wedding this village can produce. Joyful ones, reluctant ones, hasty ones, and the rare, quiet ones, where the bride and groom look at each other with such certainty that even an old verger feels a flutter in his practical heart. But I have never seen a wedding like the one that did not happen on the 14th of June, 1820, and the one that happened instead. The wedding that did not happen was the marriage of Susannah Graves, daughter of Henry Graves the draper, to Mr. Tobias Crane, curate of the neighboring parish of Millford. It was a sensible match. Mr. Crane was 29, mild-mannered and employed. Susannah was 25, kind-hearted and patient, which was the quality she would have needed most, because Mr. Crane was, and I say this with the charity my position requires, the most thoroughly unremarkable man I have ever met. He had no strong opinions, no particular talents, no visible passions, and no conversational abilities beyond a reliable capacity to discuss the weather in terms that made it sound even duller than it already was. He was the sort of man who existed in a room without altering it, a man you forgot while he was still speaking to you. Susannah deserved better. Everyone in the village knew this, though no one said it, because Henry Graves had arranged the match, and Henry Graves was a proud man who did not welcome opinions on his daughter's prospects. Susannah was the warmest person in the village. She helped in the shop, visited the sick, taught the smallest children their letters on Saturday mornings, and had a way of looking at people that made them feel, for the duration of her attention, that they were the most important person in the world. She was not beautiful in the way London would have noticed. She was round-faced, brown-haired, with a generous mouth and kind hazel eyes, but she was beautiful in the way that mattered, which is to say that she made every room she entered slightly better than it had been before. Mr. Crane did not deserve her, but he was available, and Susannah was 25, and 25 in a village where the options were Mr. Crane, a 60-year-old widowed farmer, or permanent spinsterhood, was old enough to accept the available and stop waiting for the extraordinary. The Duke of Halworth was the extraordinary. I should explain about the Duke of Halworth, because the village had only known him for 8 months and had not yet decided what to make of him. He had inherited Halworth Park, the great house on the hill, 3 miles north of the village, from a distant uncle the previous autumn, and he had arrived in November to inspect the property and stayed, inexplicably, through the winter. He was 35, unmarried, tall, dark-haired, and possessed of a fortune that the village estimated, based on the size of his stables and the quality of his coats, at somewhere between considerable and astronomical. He came to the village. This was the remarkable part. Dukes did not come to the village. The previous owner of Halworth Park had visited the estate once in 20 years, and communicated with the village entirely through his steward. The Duke of Halworth came himself. He walked through the green, nodded to the shopkeepers, bought things from the businesses he was presumably too wealthy to need, and spoke to people with a direct, serious attention that was not warm, but was not cold either. It was the attention of a man who believed that every person he met had something worth hearing, and who was willing to stand still long enough to hear it. He came to Graves's shop. He came every week. He bought handkerchiefs. He bought cravat linen. He bought a set of napkins for the house, and a bolt of curtain fabric that Mrs. Aldridge, his housekeeper, could easily have ordered from London. He came in person, and he lingered, and he spoke to Susannah. I notice this because I notice things. It is an occupational habit. 41 years of watching people in pews teaches you to read the angle of a head, the direction of a gaze, the way a hand reaches for a hymnal or a prayer book, or the arm of the person beside them. The Duke of Halworth came to Graves's shop for the linen. He stayed for Susannah. He asked her about the fabric, and she told him about thread counts and weaves, and the difference between Egyptian cotton and Lancashire, and he listened as though she were explaining the secrets of the universe, which, in a sense, she was. The secrets of her universe, the world she knew and inhabited and loved. He asked about the village. She told him about the families, the feuds, the traditions, the way the river flooded every spring, and the way the whole village turned out to sandbag the bridge. He asked about the school she ran on Saturdays. She told him about the children, their names, their difficulties, the boy who could not read, but could build anything with his hands, the girl who was brilliant at sums, but whose parents wanted her in the fields. He asked about her life. She told him, without complaint, without self-pity, with the same generous warmth she gave to everything, about the shop, her father, Mr. Crane, and the wedding that was planned for June. I watched his face when she mentioned the wedding. I am not a man given to dramatic interpretation, but I can tell you that something happened behind the Duke of Halworth's composed, serious features when Susannah Graves said the name Mr. Crane. Something that looked like a door closing, or a light going out, or a man discovering that the thing he had been reaching for was already spoken for. He continued to come to the shop every Thursday, without fail. He bought things the household could not possibly need: 12 sets of handkerchiefs, enough napkin linen to stock a hotel, a length of silk that he said was for curtains, but that any draper's daughter would have recognized as dress fabric, too fine for curtains, too beautiful for a man who lived alone. He and Susannah talked. They talked about books she read when the shop was quiet, borrowing from the lending library in the next town, and about the estate, and about what the Duke planned to do with it. And she told him the tenants needed new drainage in the east fields, and he had it done within the month. And she told him the village women needed a better water supply, and he commissioned a new pump. And she told him the church roof leaked, and he sent his own workmen to repair it. And I stood in the nave and watched the scaffolding go up, and understood that the Duke of Halworth was not fixing the church roof because he cared about the church roof. He was fixing it because Susannah had asked. The wedding was set for the 14th of June. The banns were read on 3 consecutive Sundays. I read them myself, in my best voice, from the chancel step. I published the banns of marriage between Tobias James Crane, bachelor of Millford, and Susannah Mary Graves, spinster, of this parish. No one objected. No one ever objects. The banns are a formality, a tradition, a dusty piece of ecclesiastical procedure that everyone endures and no one takes seriously. I prepared the church on the morning of the 14th. Flowers on the altar, white roses and meadowsweet, because Susannah loved wildflowers, and her mother had carried meadowsweet at her own wedding. Prayer books in the pews, font filled, brass polished. Everything in order, everything as it should be. The guests arrived at 11. Henry Graves in his best coat, his face set with the stiff pride of a man who has done his duty by his daughter. Susannah's mother, quiet and tearful in a new bonnet. The Crane family, Mr. Crane's parents, his sister, 3 cousins from Millford. The village, not all of it, but most, because weddings in a village of 300 souls are communal events, and everyone comes, whether invited or not. Susannah arrived at 11:15. She wore a white dress, simple, well-made, the work of her own hands, because she was a draper's daughter, and she knew fabric the way a painter knows color. She looked beautiful. I want to be clear about this, because what happened next could be misunderstood as a story about a woman who was rescued from an unwanted marriage, and it was not. Susannah Graves walked into St. Bartholomew's of her own free will, in her own white dress, prepared to marry Mr. Crane because he was kind and available, and she had decided that kindness and availability were enough. She was not unhappy. She was resigned, which is different, and which is worse, because unhappiness can be argued with, but resignation simply sits down and stays. Mr. Crane was not there. The vicar checked his watch. The guests murmured. Susannah stood at the back of the nave with her father, her bouquet in her hands, her face composed, and waited. At 11:30, a boy arrived from Millford with a letter. The letter was from Mr. Crane. It said, I read it afterward, when the vicar showed it to me with hands that shook with indignation, that Mr. Crane had accepted a position in a parish in Dorset, that he regretted the inconvenience, that he wished Miss Graves well, and that he had left that morning by the early coach. He had fled. The groom had fled before the vows. The silence in the church was the worst silence I have ever heard. Worse than the silence after a funeral. Worse than the silence of an empty nave at midnight. It was the silence of 100 people who did not know where to look, and of one woman in a white dress who was standing at the back of the church with a bouquet in her hands and nowhere to go. Henry Graves turned purple. Susannah's mother began to weep. The Crane family, to their credit, looked mortified. The vicar cleared his throat and began to say something about unfortunate circumstances, and perhaps if everyone would retire to the... And then the door opened. I was standing at the back, beside the font, and I saw him before anyone else did. The Duke of Halworth walked into St. Bartholomew's in his best coat, a dark, perfectly tailored coat that I had seen him wear to church on Sundays, and he walked up the center aisle with the unhurried, purposeful stride of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to explain it until he has carried it out. The church went silent again. Not the terrible silence of before, a different silence, the charged, breathless silence of 100 people watching something happen that they do not yet understand. The Duke of Halworth walked to the front of the church. He turned. He looked down the aisle at Susannah Graves, who was standing at the back in her white dress with her father's hand on her arm, and her bouquet clutched so tightly that the stems were bending. And he said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that old stone building, clear and steady, and absolutely certain, "Miss Graves." She looked at him. The whole church looked at him. "Miss Graves, your groom has not come. I have. I should have come 8 months ago, the first time I walked into your father's shop, and you told me the difference between Egyptian cotton and Lancashire, and I understood that I would never meet another woman who made the ordinary world sound like a thing worth living in. I have bought 14 sets of handkerchiefs I do not need. I have repaired a church roof and a water pump and a drainage system because you asked me to, and I would have repaired the entire county if you had asked, because I cannot refuse you anything, and I have not been able to stop thinking about you since November, and I am sorry, I am profoundly sorry, that I did not say this before now." The church was so quiet I could hear the candles. "I am not asking you to marry me today," the Duke said. "I am asking you to let me court you properly. I am asking for the chance to prove that the man who should have been standing at this altar, any man, should count himself fortunate beyond measure to have your attention, and that I, who have had it for 8 months and done nothing to deserve it, will spend the rest of my life trying." Susannah looked at him. She looked at her father, who was standing beside her with an expression of pure astonishment. She looked at her mother, who had stopped weeping and was gripping the edge of the pew with both hands. She looked at me, standing by the font in my good coat, and I gave her the smallest nod I have ever given in my career, because it was not my place, and I could not help it. She walked down the aisle, not toward the altar, toward the Duke, who was standing at the front of the church with his hands at his sides and his composure intact and his eyes, if you looked closely, slightly bright. She walked with the steady, unhurried grace of a woman who has spent her whole life making rooms better by entering them, and when she reached him she said, "Your Grace, you have been buying handkerchiefs from my father's shop every Thursday for 8 months. I have. You do not need 14 sets of handkerchiefs. I do not. You came for me. I came for you." She looked at him, this tall, serious, extraordinary man who had walked into her ordinary life, and quietly, without announcement, without expectation, made it the center of his own, and she said, "Then you had better court me properly, and you may start by walking me home." He walked her home. The whole village watched, 100 people streaming out of the church and lining the lane as the Duke of Halworth walked Susannah Graves from St. Bartholomew's to the draper's shop, her bouquet still in her hand, his arm offered, and her hand resting on it, and neither of them saying a word, because some things do not require words, and the village, for once, did not require explanations. He courted her for 3 months. He came to the shop every day, not Thursdays, every day, and he sat in the back room while she worked the counter, and they talked the way they had always talked, about linen and children and drainage and books, except that now there was no Mr. Crane between them, and the conversation had a warmth that it had not had before, a warmth that came from the simple, extraordinary fact of 2 people who had found each other and were no longer pretending they had not. He proposed in September, in the shop, standing between the bolts of cotton and the shelves of thread, because he said he had fallen in love with her in this room, and he wanted to ask her in this room, and he did not care that it smelled of sizing and lavender, and that there was a customer waiting for 6 yards of muslin. Susannah said yes. The customer applauded. Henry Graves, who had watched the entire courtship with the bewildered gratitude of a man whose pride has been exceeded by his love for his daughter, shook the Duke's hand and wept into a handkerchief that the Duke had probably purchased from him the previous Thursday. They married in October at St. Bartholomew's. I prepared the church, the same flowers, the same prayer books, the same polished brass. Susannah wore the same white dress, because she said she had made it for a wedding and it deserved one. The village came, all of it, this time, not most, and they filled every pew and stood along the walls and watched the Duke of Halworth place a ring on the hand of the draper's daughter and look at her as though she were the only person in the room, which, to him, she was. The groom fled before the vows. A duke no one invited stood and said her name. And the woman who had resigned herself to the available discovered, in the space of a single extraordinary morning, that the extraordinary had been buying handkerchiefs in her father's shop for 8 months, waiting, with a patience I have rarely seen in 41 years of watching people, for the courage to say what he should have said the first time she told him about Egyptian cotton. I have prepared the church for 318 weddings now. I remember them all, but the one I remember best is the one that did not happen on the 14th of June, and the one that happened instead, in October, when the Duke walked Susannah home from a wedding that wasn't, and she gave him a chance, and he gave her the rest of his life.